All right, is your brain hurting yet? If not, we're going to have to work on that. Hey, let's wrap up our metaphysical exploration this week by considering a thought experiment called Mary's Room. Mary's Room is a thought experiment that is often used to explore questions about knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, what kinds of knowledge we can acquire. But I think it may work for the kinds of questions we've been asking about consciousness and experience and metaphysics. And the thought experiment goes something like this. So imagine, if you will, our hero Mary. She has spent every moment of her existence from birth, now well into adulthood, in a room that is entirely gray. Different shades of gray, some dark gray, some light gray, but no other colors than gray. In fact, the room is even lit in such a way that when she looks at her skin, it appears gray. When she goes to sit down and eat her meal of beets and green beans, it all appears different shades of gray. So she's never experienced any color other than these shades of gray. Now, important, as with a lot of thought experiments, you've got to suspend all your disbelief. Yes, this is completely impractical and inhumane, and nobody would ever do this. But when we use thought experiments, we want to see what the implications are of a particular situation, or what the implications of some ideas are. So you just got to kind of roll with it, even though it seems really impractical and unbelievable. All right. So fortunately, though, Mary has spent her time very wisely as she's been confined to this room. She's spent her entire life becoming the world premier expert in neuroscience and physics. She knows everything there is to know that physics can tell us, and everything that neuroscience can tell us. And in particular, what Mary's really good at is light and color. And she has studied the properties of light and color and can tell you everything that physics can tell us about light and color. And she's also studied the connection between how brains process data that comes from light and color. So she can tell you what's happening in the brain when a brain is processing red or blue or green. She's never experienced these colors herself, but she knows everything there is to know about what's happening in the brain. All right, so here's the question. One day, Mary gets released from this room and finds there's a whole world outside she never knew of, and it's a world full of color. And so the question I'd want you to consider here is, what's the nature of the experience that Mary is having at that moment she walks out of the room into this colorful world? At this point, what's occurring in her existence? Okay, so think about it that way. Not necessarily, oh, wow, there's a tree, there's this, there's that. What's the nature of the experience that she's having at that moment? Okay, and that's really the question that we want to finish up with is, what exactly is experience? What does it mean to have experience? Is it a physical event? Is my brain producing just a bunch of stimuli? Thomas Nagel sort of proposes this question. That seems really counterintuitive, because if it's something physical, you'd think we could cut open the brain and then see the experience, but we can't. Just like we can't see the taste of chocolate or have the experience of tasting a chocolate just by licking a brain, or by looking at a brain of someone who is tasting chocolate. So there seems to be this idea, or there seems to be this sort of mental phenomenon going on, something that's beyond physical. Is it something that's created by the physical, or is it essentially an immaterial, non-physical thing that's occurring, this idea of mentality? So think about when you're on the beach, you're throwing the frisbee for your kid or with your parent, and you're having an experience that's profoundly different than the experience you might have when you're sleeping. So imagine and in fact, maybe when you're sleeping and not dreaming, maybe you're not having any kind of experience. So think about that for a moment. You're sleeping and not dreaming. What doesn't exist at that moment that does exist for you when you're playing frisbee? Last year, I had surgery on my spine. Yes, I know, you're jealous. And I remember being wheeled into the operating room. And I remember a nurse there and an anesthesiologist on my right-hand side. And all of a sudden, I started to feel funny, so I kind of started to freak out. And I said, uh-oh, should I be, is it okay that I feel kind of weird? And the nurse said, oh, yeah, I think he just gave you a Mickey. I think he just started giving you anesthesia. The next thing I remember in my life was waking up in the recovery room. There was a stretch of 4 hours between those two experiences of my existence that I have absolutely no recollection of. And I don't know for sure if I was having any experience in that stretch of 4 hours. So what is what's the thing that exists in the moment that you're playing Frisbee on the beach that doesn't exist when you're under anesthesia, when you're anesthetized? Okay. And is that thing that exists something that can also exist for a dog or in a dog? So if it's not two human beings playing Frisbee, but instead it's a human being and a dog, we know that the human being is having something we could call an experience that doesn't perhaps happen when we're sleeping and not dreaming. Is the dog having an experience? And if the dog is it qualitatively identical to what a human being would experience if it were playing Frisbee? Or is it somehow different? Is it a less rich experience? Is it a less complex experience? Is it the kind of thing that might exist in an ant or a tree? Is this thing that exists when we're playing Frisbee but not sleeping or under anesthesia, not anesthetized, is that the kind of thing that can exist in an ant or a tree? There's weird phenomenon that happen with trees. If something starts to invade one tree as a kind of a threat, it starts to burrow into its bark, and the tree in response will start to emit, say, a chemical or sap as a way of rejecting or defending itself against this invader. In some cases, there may be other trees in the forest that aren't being invaded that somehow pick up on that's what's going on over there, and then they start to generate a defensive response in anticipation of being invaded by this species. Well, how did that happen? Or how does that happen? It almost sounds like trees kind of communicating in some way. Now, not communicating in the way that you and I are, right? You don't walk into the forest and see trees talking with one another. But clearly there's no information about an event that's occurring elsewhere that gets somehow communicated, weird words to be applying to trees, communicated to other trees that aren't yet experiencing that event. Is that an indication that trees or ants have also this thing we're calling experience, but they just have it in a different manner or a different degree? Does the experience of trees actually exist? And what about rocks or atoms? Do those exist? Do those have experiences? Do experiences in rocks exist? Okay. You're going to read this article, the last thing you're reading for this week, by a really interesting philosopher named Philip Goff. I'll put a link to a podcast he appeared on where he explores some of these questions that we're talking about here. And in this piece, he's going to raise this question about, well, what exactly is this thing called consciousness? And how does it exist? How does experience exist? Not like, oh my gosh, how does this happen? But in what form does this exist? We clearly know from the previous examples that this thing called consciousness and experience exist in some way. Well, in what way? Is this a physical thing? Is this something that exists physically? In other words, materially? Or, as we were exploring earlier, is this something that exists non-physically? It's immaterial. Now, in this essay, Goff is going to mention a theory called physicalism, which we'll talk about next week. But all you need to know to make it through his essay is physicalism is the theory that the only things that exist are physical things, and the only things that can exist are physical things. So he's going to approach consciousness from as a way of kind of responding to this position that the only things that exist are physical things. His question is this: does consciousness exist entirely? Does it exist entirely present or absent, or does it exist in degrees? So think about the question of throwing the Frisbee for the child, throwing the Frisbee for the dog. If they're both experiencing consciousness, are they experiencing it to the same degree, or does one have a richer, sort of greater experience of the moment, a more complex one? All right, so make your way through Goff. Like I say, he's a really interesting guy, and he's posing an interesting question, actually he's laying out an interesting theory about what exactly exists and how it exists as this relates to experience and consciousness. All right, so don't get frustrated with it. Read it out loud. That'll help. Read it out loud. Just try to get the main ideas and see if you think he's offering a viable theory.